I was a British diplomat for over 20 years. We still have a certain tendency in the British Foreign Office to look down on the rest of the world. I was seated one day in my office, in the Foreign Office, which is a wonderful palatial building in London from which a third of the world used to be governed. And I sat there, and the phone rang, and I said, "Oh, Craig, Charles here. Would you like to be ambassador in Uzbekistan?" And I said, "Yes, great, Charles, thanks." Thinking, where on earth is Uzbekistan? And I said, "Why me?" And he said, this is absolutely true, he said, "You speak Polish, don't you?" And I said, "Yes, but I doubt the Uzbeks do." And he said, "No, but they speak Russian, old boy, and it's all the same thing." So, on the basis of my knowledge of a Slavic language, I found myself as ambassador to Uzbekistan, where nobody spoke Polish at all. Fortunately, I did pick up some Russian. It's an awful place. It's a totalitarian dictatorship. I'd served in dictatorships before. There's a difference between, any dictatorship's bad, obviously, but there's a difference between dictatorship and totalitarianism. Uzbekistan is totalitarian. Let me tell you about something that happened last week, just to give you an example. And it's not nearly as bad as the absolutely true story about the people who were boiled alive. Just last week, a British man of no political interest whatsoever, who had married an Uzbek lady, was on holiday in St. Petersburg. And his wife now has UK nationality, but was traveling on her Uzbek passport because that way she didn't have to apply for a Russian visa and they'd save $100. And she was arrested in Russia because her Uzbek exit visa had expired, because you still leave permission to leave Uzbekistan. They still lock their population in. And the Russians shipped her back to Tashkent, where she's now in prison for having outstayed her exit visa. And the couple have been separated, and there's very little chance the man will ever see his wife again. That's the kind of country it is. And as I say, that's a more workaday example than the boiled alive people who were interrogated. But when you think of Uzbekistan, you have to think of a country that hasn't moved on since it left the Soviet Union. In fact, it left the Soviet Union in order to maintain the Soviet system. It left because it didn't want to implement the Gorbachev-style reforms. Its president, President Karimov, was one of the members of the Politburo who had moved to have Gorbachev arrested in that occasion when Yeltsin was standing on the tanks outside the White House when he first came to great prominence in Western eyes. When you think of Uzbekistan, you have to think of the Soviet Union, but not Gorbachev's Soviet Union. You have to think of Brezhnev's Soviet Union, and that's the kind of regime it is, but with, since independence, even more cruelty. When I was going there, it was viewed as the United States' most important ally in Central Asia. The Americans had been given a very large airbase at Kashi-Khanabad, known as K2, from which supplies and operations were mounted into Afghanistan. I was told that there weren't that many British interests in Uzbekistan, and my primary interest was in supporting the Americans, supporting the American ambassador, and ensuring that Uzbekistan remained an ally in the war on terror. I was told that whenever I made any speech in public, I was to refer to President Karimov of Uzbekistan as our ally on all occasions. You know, there are over 10,000 political prisoners in Uzbekistan. Anybody who is a religious Muslim of any kind, no connection to terrorism, anyone who prays 5 times a day as prescribed, will be arrested as a terrorist. Any young man with a beard will be arrested. There are at least 700 Baptists in Uzbek jails because it's illegal to be a Baptist in Uzbekistan. Many people are there simply because they are political prisoners. And if you enter an Uzbek prison, your chances of coming out alive are actually quite slim. They still have and operate the old Soviet gulags. I found more and more evidence of abuse and torture. Torture in Uzbekistan isn't unusual. It happens to several thousand people every year. When I'm talking of torture, I'm not talking of marginal definitions of torture. I'm talking of people being raped with broken bottles. I'm talking of people having their children tortured in front of them until they signed confessions. I'm talking of people being boiled alive. And the intelligence from these torture sessions was being received by the CIA and was being passed on. I was eventually seeing it as it was passed on to me via MI6, because MI6 and the CIA share all their intelligence. And there was a common thread. I was investigating the evidence of torture. I met people who'd been tortured and escaped. I met people like the old widow with the photos of her son who'd been boiled alive. Her son was returned to her in a sealed casket, and she was ordered to bury the casket the next day, which Muslims would do anyway. They'd bury the body the very next day. But she was ordered not to open the casket, not to look at her son. It was returned to her from Jazlik prison. She did in the middle of the night. She was a very, very brave and determined old lady. She got the casket open and the body out, and she took these photographs, which showed that he had been boiled alive. And it was a chap who is now actually the chief pathologist of the UK who investigated the photographs for me and produced that conclusion. When people were being tortured, as we spoke to, we even had letters smuggled out of jails. We were learning what people had to confess to under torture. And they were being told to confess to membership of Al-Qaeda. They were told to confess that they'd been in training camps in Afghanistan. And they were told to confess that they had met Osama bin Laden